Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Yasmine Mohammed podcast, where today we have a very special guest who I'm very excited to be chatting with. In fact, I had so much trouble narrowing down the questions that I was going to ask her because there's so many things I wanted to talk to her about. Today we have Einat Wilf. Einat is the author of 7 books that explore key issues in Israeli society. She's got a few of them behind her right now, but today we'll be mainly discussing her latest, which I've got right here. It's called The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. Please pick this up. I cannot tell you, even as somebody who's like born and raised into this conflict, my father's from Gaza, and this has been like a part of my life, my whole life. It was really, really great to get such insight, so many things that I didn't know, actually. I don't even know like what kind of team of researchers you had to help you with this book, but they are amazing. So fantastic work on this book. Einat, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's a real honor and pleasure. Thank you.
Great. So I wanted to start off today with just asking you a bit about yourself. So where did you grow up? Kind of what was your childhood like? How did you get into, speaking on this topic and writing so many books on it? Just a little bit of your personal story.
Certainly. So I was born and raised in Israel, in Jerusalem, in one of its very kind of normal middle-class neighborhoods called Beit HaKerem, a very secular upbringing, and generally, just a very happy Israeli childhood, parents who were academics. From a fairly early age, as a young teenager, I don't know why, but I was attracted to anything and everything that stood at the intersection of Israel, the Jewish people, and the world at large. I would read the works of Abba Eban, for example, our legendary ambassador to the UN, a foreign minister, and just was always fascinated by the idea of telling the story of Israel in the world. And that kind of dream, ambition shaped much of my adult life. It's the reason, for example, that I decided to study abroad. I thought, okay, I need to be able to know the world, to speak English well. And yes, and over time, I realized that writing is a key tool in the ability to reflect and tell the story. And I became, quite to my surprise, more and more of a writer. I wasn't much of a writer. I struggled to be a decent writer in high school and in college. And yeah, and then that brought me later into politics, but that's kind of the quick background.
I see. I imagine surviving intifadas, the violence around that, because I know that touched every Israeli, like regardless, everybody was living in fear during those days, which makes it especially heinous today that we're hearing the call to globalize the intifada, because a lot of people aren't really, hopefully, let's hope that a lot of people aren't really understanding what they're saying when they say that. They're like, oh no, it just means struggle or whatever it was. I don't know. Which
Yes.
is also the word for Mein Kampf, also the word for jihad. It just kind of gets thrown out there. But I imagine that probably shaped a lot of your childhood, probably.
Certainly, I mean, I grew up politically very much in the Israeli political left. As a young adult, when I can vote, I vote for all the Israeli peace camp leaders. I vote for Rabin. That's the first time I can vote. I vote for Ehud Barak. I'm euphoric throughout the 90s at the prospect of peace. And the failure of the peace negotiations, the fact that Ehud Barak offered Palestinians a state, an end to the occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, all the things that we were thought were the reasons for violence. And the fact that Palestinians and their leader, Arafat, walked away from a clear, concrete opportunity to have a state. And then, like you described, not only did he walk away from it, it was followed by a campaign of murderous violence and just massacres in our street. And you're right that before October 7th, this was the darkest time to live in Israel. There was a palpable sense that if you just went out to a cafe or you boarded a bus, you were playing Russian roulette with your life. And this was weeks and months after Palestinians could have had everything we were told they wanted. So I, like a lot of Israelis from the peace camp, began to ask a very simple question. Then what is it that the Palestinians want? Because it's clearly not statehood, and it's clearly not an end to Israel's military presence in the West Bank and Gaza, and it's clearly not about the settlements and not even about Jerusalem. And that really began me on the journey and the research that became the War of Return. And the entire team of researchers is Adi and I. Adi Schwartz, my
Oh, yeah.
co-writer. Yes, he's a gifted writer and researcher, and it's just the two of us.
Oh, amazing. Okay. I honestly thought that you had like a whole army of people. You guys did amazing work. I met him when I was in Israel, and he's also fantastic. So it's a treat to now be able to meet you as well, of course. You know, what you were talking about there, starting off on the political left, really believing that this two-state solution was something that was possible. Even though I started on the political left as well, I actually, because of my upbringing, I never thought that that could ever come to be, because a lot of the quotes that you were sharing here of a lot of the Arab leaders and Palestinian leaders basically saying, you know, the problem isn't that the issue isn't that we want statehood. The issue is that we don't want Jewish people to have a state. That's, you know, some of them said the quiet part out loud, but that's all we ever hear. You know, that's the inside voice of the Muslims and the Arabs. So that's the only thing I ever heard, is that they want the state of Israel to be completely eradicated and for it to all be Arab, and they will never stop fighting until that day comes. And doesn't matter how many lives are lost towards that end, that will always be the goal. And when you had rational people like my dad, who would say things like, it's a thriving country, it's a thriving metropolis, full of people, full of families, like, what are you talking about? You have to accept reality. Just like, let's start from where we are here. Stop living in this, you know, la la land dream state. But let's move forward from this point onward. He would be completely eviscerated by his friends, family, colleagues, anybody who heard him speak that way, because as far as they were concerned, he was a Zionist collaborator, a traitor, a blah, 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 just because he believed in peace with Israelis. He didn't just believe in coexistence, he believed in like thriving relationships between the two neighboring states. And, you know, we lost him before October 7th, but in a way, I'm kind of grateful that he didn't get to see what Hamas did to his homeland, because he really did believe that this might happen one day, that Gaza might return to the way that it was when he was a child. You know, he was absolutely horrified and disgusted by what Hamas had done. And starting with Yasser Arafat, in fact, it was just a slow build to Hamas. So, you know, I think it's really interesting that you've gone through, I think it's really important too, that you would share with us that, you know, that trajectory of you going from being on the left and really believing this was possible. Because I think after October 7th, a lot of people are probably starting to question if it is even possible at all. And I'm glad that you delved so much into it, in this book, to give some people some insight on where your thoughts are. But since you've written the book and since October 7th, have you had any changes in that regard? Have you had any shifts in your thinking?
So at one point, first of all, it would have been nice to know you 10 and 20 years ago, and then I would have just listened to you. Because one of the main lessons for me that came out of that entire experience is that I should actually give Palestinians the respect of listening to them and taking them at their word, because they have actually said it all along in different ways, in different forms. But to their credit, they've been absolutely consistent by now for a century in their complete and total rejection of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in any part of the land, in any borders, in any size of Israel. And really coming to terms with the fact that this was as encompassing, as broad, and as total, and that this was really at the core of the conflict. It wasn't a conflict between two peoples with claim to land who therefore each can have some of it and that will resolve it. Neither will have all of it, each will have some of it, and then we'll resolve it. That's the idea behind a two-state solution. I realized that it's actually a conflict, and in the book, I include the quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II, when he, already in February 47, before settlements, before occupation, before
One of my
refugees,
texts.
yes, says that, you know, the conflict between the Jews and the Arabs, it's between the Jews wanting a state and the Arabs wanting the Jews not to have a state. And that's why he calls it irreconcilable, because you can't divide that up. If the Jews want a state and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state, there's no compromise here. There's no dividing it. So after October 7th, some people have approached a DNI and they said, you know, maybe you'll update the book, or, you know, and Adi tell me, but what am I going to write? I told you so. Like,
That's
so
it just confirmed a lot of what you've said in this
exactly.
book.
So, I mean, essentially, it has been confirmed. I will say that one thing began a kind of more dark thought that began to creep into my thinking after October 7th is when I started my journey looking at this conflict and what's really going on, and UNRWA's role in really being the ideological backbone of that. I thought, okay, we are writing a compelling book. Like you said, a lot of research. The facts are all there. Once you read it, I think you just can't deny the reality of what UNRWA does, its role in the perpetuation of the conflict. And I thought I would bring it to all these European capitals that are funding UNRWA, and they will see it, and they will see how supporting UNRWA undermines their own official policy of seeking peace by means of two states. And I've spent by now, 15 years advocating, writing, researching, bringing those ideas to various European and Western capitals. And at one point, a darker thought has been sneaking in, that could it be that the problem is not ignorance? It's not that they don't know the facts, and once I bring them the facts, they'll see the light. Could it be that somewhere deep inside, those in the West are funding UNRWA because they actually share the goal of UNRWA of no Jewish state? Could it be that somewhere inside the West remains a deep ambivalence with the existence of a Jewish state, and one of their ways of outsourcing that ambivalence is to fund the forever Palestinian war against Jewish self-determination through UNRWA? So that's the one thing that kind of developed more after October 7th.
I mean, it's a definitely a reasonable question to be asking. It's a scary one to ask, you know, to think about, but it makes sense that you would be feeling that way right now. I have to tell you though, before reading your book, I didn't know that UNRWA was not actually affiliated with the UN. Because like you said, you know, it was that duplicitous, you know, demanding that the acronym have UN in it to give off that impression, and it worked. I honestly did think that it was I think a lot of people, not that we should be putting any kind of faith in the UN, but I think a lot of people really do. And they think, oh, well, the UN is managing this, like they're paying attention. Obviously, it's not just a free-for-all with a bunch of, you know, terrorist sympathizers indoctrinating children in schools. Like, let's not be silly. Like, you just trust that there are adults in the room managing this project. So it was actually quite surprising to me to find out that it was all a farce.
Yes, the thing about UNRWA is really the more you get into it, the more that it really becomes insane and shocking. Because as I said, I've been at it by now for 15 years. And over the years, I think quite a few people raise their eyebrows thinking, okay, it's kind of a fringe obsession for Einat. And my argument was that it's actually not a fringe obsession. It's at the core of the conflicts. It's at the core of what makes the forever war possible. It's at the core of the Western indulgence of this idea. So one of the things that you discover is how powerful the letters UN are and how far-reaching the Arabs were in demanding that this temporary mechanism established by the UN General Assembly, but it's not part of the UN bodies. It's basically something that the UN General Assembly voted to establish as a temporary mechanism to settle refugees. It was established for 18 months. They expect it to be done in a year and a half. And to know that the Arabs insisted that the letters UN appear in the name. So rather than it be calling RIWA, as it was going to be called, to insist that it's going to be called UNRWA, because they understood already then the power of those letters. And to the present, very few people understand that UNRWA is actually a purely Palestinian organization run by Palestinians for Palestinians. Everyone's employed a Palestinian. The only people who are European are pretty much the managers at the top in order to maintain the facade. But other than that, it's all Palestinian, and it's all for the Palestinian cause of no Jewish state. But even today, the letters are so powerful that people will hear, oh, UN employees were killed in Gaza, and you imagine Swedes and Norwegians and Danes that came to help the suffering people of Gaza, and you don't really understand that these are Gazan-born Palestinians who've lived there all their lives. They are the teachers, they are the administrators, they are the people who are running the operation, and it's not a UN agency the way that people think of UN agencies as kind of global and neutral and for a purpose that is peaceful. It's a purely Palestinian agency for the Palestinian purpose of no Jewish state.
Now, while we're on this topic, I have to ask you something that I really need to understand. So UNRWA gets billions of dollars from member states all over the world, and that money just pours into Gaza. And you've outlined in your book how difficult it is to determine exactly how many Palestinian refugees there are globally. And what I want to understand, though, is for decades, for generations, even though it's been impossible to determine the actual number of Palestinian refugees worldwide, how is it that the people living currently right now in Palestine are considered refugees? Refugees from what? What they are in their homeland. So they are being governed, in Gaza, they're being governed by the people that they elected. So how are they considered refugees? And how are all these UN states giving money towards these refugees that are living in their homeland?
So that exactly is another element of the absurdity. Three things. The Arab states and the Arab refugees did three things when they essentially began the process of hijacking UNRWA. Once they made sure that UNRWA did not settle a single Arab refugee, because they knew that by settling them, the war against the Jewish state would be over, and that was unacceptable to them. So when UNRWA was still when there were still foreigners there, they basically put on fire the installations, attacked the staff, until it was made sure that no Arab refugee is getting settled. And then they did three things. They made sure that it was called UNRWA because the letters UN were very powerful, and they wanted to convey this notion that the UN is responsible for the fact that there are Arab refugees, rather than accepting the consequences of their terrible and poor choice to wage war against the Jewish state rather than accept partition. The second thing that they did is to get a loophole. And that goes to your question. They made sure that at the time that UNRWA was created for 18 months to settle the Arab refugees, the UN created the actual UN Agency for Refugees, known as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. That agency actually implements the Refugee Convention. And the Refugee Convention, in the spirit of the UN and post-World War II, looks at three ways to end a person's refugee status. One way is to go back home, if that's possible. But if that's not possible, for whatever reason, they don't care, they don't prioritize it. They either find a way to settle that person in place or a third place. So the Arab refugees, now known as Palestinians, understood that if the Refugee Convention, so if international standards were to be upheld with respect to the Arab refugees, they understood that within a few short years, there will be no refugees and the Jewish state will get to stay and will be accepted as a done deal. And for them, that was unacceptable. So they secured a loophole. And the loophole said that the UNHCR deals with all refugees in the world except those who have an agency. And then the third step that they did is to make sure that UNRWA never closes. As a result, because the loophole depends on UNRWA never closing, on there being another agency, which is why after 75 years, UNRWA is still amazingly temporary. So because they have this loophole, they can say and do whatever they want without being subject to any international standards. One of the ways in which they inflate the numbers of those that they register as refugees is by not being subject to any international standard. And one of them is, of course, like you said, 2.2 million who are registered by UNRWA as refugees from Palestine live in the West Bank and Gaza. Whatever your political opinions, I think we can agree that West Bank and Gaza are in Palestine. They're Palestine. So how can you be born in Palestine? By now, we're talking into the fifth generation. So these are people who are born in Palestine, never displaced from Palestine, grew there all their lives, and yet UNRWA registers them as refugees from Palestine. Now, anywhere else in the world, this is nonsensical. But because UNRWA is a Palestinian agency for the purpose of keeping alive the idea that Israel is a temporary aberration, they know what it means, because for them, even though they live in Gaza or live in Ramallah, and you can be a middle-class 30-year-old lawyer living in Ramallah, you will be registered as a refugee, a Palestine refugee, despite being born and living all your life in Ramallah, because the Palestine that you're a refugee from is the mythical Palestine that will one day replace Israel from the river to the sea. And that's how they pull it off.
Wow. Wow. I'm still shocked that this whole farce is continuing, because there's so much money going into it from all of these UN member states. How come nobody has asked questions about where is our money going? Who is managing this process? Why is nobody asking questions? Like, it blows my mind. And I guess that goes back to your question of like, is this truly ignorance, or are they happy to just let these Palestinians do the dirty work for them? Because it really is perplexing. Like it really doesn't make any sense that nobody would be concerned about these questions, which are incredibly important questions, especially when your country is giving so much funding towards a cause. You need to understand exactly where that money is going, how it's being used, what are the parameters, what are the logistics, what are the structures, what am I supporting? So yeah, my gosh. Okay,
Yeah.
so really, guys, this UNRWA issue is so much bigger. There's so much more. This is part of the reason why I had so much trouble narrowing down the questions to ask Einat. Read this book, get this book, understand more. Like I said, somebody who's born and raised in this conflict. I learned so much, and it's written it's a very easy read. It's not a heavy academic read. It's very easy. I mean, it's easy as in it's easy to read. It's not easy to consume. Obviously, it deals with very dark and troubling and exhausting topics. But I highly recommend that you pick this up and learn more about this UNRWA situation, because I got to get on with so many other questions, because if I keep going down this rabbit hole, I'm never going to get out of it. So let's talk about the West today. Let's talk about these protests that we're seeing going on everywhere. You know, you've talked a lot about how anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. You've spoken very clearly on that, and I will ask you that question in a moment. But before I even ask you that question, I want to talk about how we can see the clear evidence of the fact that these two are constantly conflated when you look at the protests that are going on out there in the world today. And a lot of us are really scratching our heads at this blatant anti-Semitism. Like when you're hearing gas the Jews, burn Tel Aviv to the ground, like how are you even going to talk about this? Is clearly these people are not, this is not a political issue here, right? They're not criticizing the state of Israel. They are full on hating Jewish people and calling for their genocide, even from the river to the sea. Khaybar, Khaybar, globalize the Intifada. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on with so much clear evidence that it is vicious and obsessive anti-Semitism that we're hearing. So you have a really great way of describing this phenomenon, because I know this is something that I've talked with so many guests in the past. People have asked me this question. It's something that we're all struggling with right now. But the way that you described this phenomenon, I felt was really, really great. It's so concise and it's so clear. And you called it the placard strategy, where this simplistic, almost nursery rhyme level binary is being fed to the youth through Soviet and Arab propaganda. So please explain this whole strategy to us.
So what I've begun to explore and notice many years ago is really the use of certain words, apartheid, racism, colonialism, genocide, and Nazism. I remember when white supremacy began to appear. And the reason that I called it the placard strategy is that it's most notable on placards and anti-Israel demonstrations. They're built very simply. On one side, it says Israel, Zionism, the Star of David. Then there's an equation sign. And then on the other side of the equation is a litany of words such as colonialism, racism, apartheid, white supremacy, and then it escalates into Nazism and genocide. And it's the pretension is that these are words that were chosen for their relation to reality, but you only need to be here a day to know that's not true. They're actually chosen because they're perceived and universally perceived as connoting evil. And the way that the placard strategy works is exactly by this repetition of almost a nursery rhyme that Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil. And the end point of that, we saw it in placards and recently in anti-Israel demonstrations. I remember when I first saw it and I was like, okay, we've reached the final station of the strategy, because those placards said, keep the world clean. And you saw Star of David in a trash bin. If you create over decades the idea that Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil. Now, the placards is where you see it visually, but the placard strategy is employed on social media, in academia. You can get PhDs in Zionism is colonialism, Zionism is racism. It was inserted indeed by the Soviet Union and Arab and Muslim countries to UN bodies. Zionism is racism is brought to the UN General Assembly in 1975, using the automatic majority to pass it, to give it respectability. bringing the case of genocide to the International Court of Justice is a page out of this playbook. The idea is to create an all-round assault that constantly repeats those mantras in a way that gives it respectability, plus it's repetitive. And then the end point of that is keep the world clean. Because if you are telling people day in, day out that Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil, then people's instinct is people want to do good. Certainly students on campus, they want to do good. They consider themselves people who want to do good. Well, by definition, the greatest good you can do in this world is to eradicate evil, right? That's the definition. If you eradicate evil, you did the greatest good. So what this process really does is prepare a global mindset by which the eradication of evil, which is Israel, Zionism, Star of David, by any means necessary, right? We're hearing them. So you're actually telling people all means of violence are justified because this is for the purpose of eradicating evil. And this idea that what stands between this messy, dirty world and a clean world, a world of utopia, is the collective Jew, the Star of David, is actually one of the most ancient and, of course, one of the most dangerous ideas out there. So the students themselves might believe that they are doing good and that they're fighting against good, and they might be Jews themselves, or they might certainly think of themselves as people who don't hate Jews. This is why I don't define it as hatred. But they don't understand that they're participating in something that is so much bigger than them and that has always ended in one way, and that is with no Jews left. I studied the history of all the places in the last century where anti-Zionism became the dominant ideology, being the respectable replacement for the discredited anti-Semitism. And whether it's the Arab world from Morocco to Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, Poland in '68, Venezuela, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, today's American campuses, when this ideology comes to dominate a place, if it's not fought against, if it's not stopped, it always ends with no Jews left.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a monk debate that I watched a clip of, the final words from Douglas Murray, where he said basically, you know, the Jewish people have survived generation after generation after generation of people trying to eradicate them, coming up with all sorts of different methods. You know, now you've got your, you know, you think you've got your you know, anti-Zionism, that's not anti-Semitism, we don't really hate Jews, whatever, you know, whatever you're using towards your goal, I want you all to know that Jewish people will continue to thrive, they will continue to live, they will outlive you all. And it was actually a, you know, a really great quote that I'm not giving it justice, but it was really well said. And I feel that way, obviously, you know, I feel that way, obviously, for the Jewish people. And I think that, you know, I want to hear your perspective on this, but I kind of feel that Gazans and Palestinians in general are starting to sense that as well. They're starting to sense like, okay, guys, they're not giving up. We're not going to get this country back. Like, this isn't going to happen. We've tried, you know, for almost a century. We've lost, you know, our entire lives over this. We haven't been, we haven't thrived. Our children haven't thrived. Hamas really contributed to this, really has made them feel like this dream that they were being sold was being sold to them by terrorists, essentially by these caliphate mongers, whether it's, you know, Hezbollah or whoever it is that Iran is funding. And they're finally at the point where I think, you know, they've gone through all the stages of grief, and maybe they're at acceptance now. Maybe they're at the point where they're feeling like, you know what? I don't care so much about this Palestinian cause, you know, anymore. This cause has been projected onto us in a lot of ways. They just want to live at this point. In fact, one of their campaigns was called "We Want to Live," where they just want to live in peace, prosperity, freedom. They, you know, basic human rights. And I really do believe that Arab states are at that point as well. Arab states are sick and tired of this issue. They're sick and tired of this conflict. And obviously, there's still going to be those like Qatar and Iran and those who are still with that Islamist mindset and that political Islam hope to, you know, eradicate all Jews, eradicate all Christians, eradicate all non-believers, and make the whole planet bow to Allah. Of course, those people are still going to exist. But I'm feeling like that there might be a sense from the mainstream that people are ready to accept reality. Do you feel that as well, or do you get a different sense?
So I sincerely hope that you're right. Sometimes I define the conflict as a battle of mutual exhaustion, where the Arab side is trying to exhaust the Jews to give up on their state by wars, terrorism, boycotts, international condemnations, basically get the Jewish state not to exist, either through a violent cataclysm or through exhaustion. Basically, we'll say, you know what, not worth it, and we'll go. And then I say that we're trying to exhaust them not to leave. They're clearly the dominant majority in the region. We're trying to exhaust them to finally let us be, to finally decide that they want to live next to a Jewish state rather than instead of it. The thing is, and what you're saying is interesting, because we might be approaching a moment, and what I fear is that we should not lose it, because what happened with the Palestinian cause, which unfortunately for the last century has been nothing but the cause of no Jewish state, is because this was the cause, it was always supported by every anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist power for the last century. So in the 30s and 40s, the Arabs have a very fruitful collaboration with the Nazis. And in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the Pan-Arabists really make Palestinianism into their secular theology. And the only thing that unites Arab countries during that time is their mutual and desire to see the Jewish state gone. And then they're defeated, and the Soviet Union takes over and takes Palestinianism global with anti-Zionism. And ultimately, when the Soviet Union is gone, Iran goes into the breach. So the thing, because the Palestinian cause has been such a great facade for anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism globally, it was too useful, which means that every time that individual Palestinians were exhausted, every time they lost yet another useless war, and they could have said, you know what, just like, you know what, not worth it. You know, putting all our resources, efforts to destroying the Jewish state, not a great use of our resources. How about we just live next to the Jewish state rather than instead of it? Every time that they could have gone in that direction, because they were so useful, whatever anti-Semitic power existed at the moment immediately rushed to say, no, 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 change nothing, reconsider nothing. You are pure victims of absolute evil. This is another reason that I fear what's going on in the West, because you're seeing all these people in the West rushing to basically tell Palestinians, this is your rights, this is justice, keep fighting. Like, there's no consequences. October 7th is not your fault. The war has nothing to do with October 7th. There's no cause and effect here. So you're already seeing them play this role of telling the Palestinians, change nothing. And we know that from the few courageous Palestinian voices who are saying, we want to live next to a Jewish state. The last century was a waste of time and resources. We need a different future. They're being ostracized, like you described your father, because how dare they, heaven forbid, develop that vision. So that's one of the reasons that I want to highlight that, yes, maybe we might have this moment where some Palestinians will rise up to say enough is enough. And we just need to make sure that this time around, you don't have UNRWA and you don't have whatever anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist power just rushing to keep this whole situation and this forever war going.
No, you're absolutely right. I can totally see it from that perspective. It is depressing, but very clear that even though a lot of Palestinian people can see that they are being used by pawns, they are being used as pawns, sorry, whether it's by these different groups of people or different states that just hate Jews, including these Islamist states and Islamist people. And they're starting to recognize, I had one guy on this podcast, a man from Gaza named Ahmed, who told me the story of he was in Los Angeles and he met this Lebanese woman and he described what she was wearing because it's relevant. He's like, she was in a tank top and shorts and she goes up to him and she's like, how is it that you're from Gaza and you're here in LA? Like, you really should be over there fighting. And he's like, the audacity of these Arabs, they really think that we are going to be just fodder for their war. And they want us to, through this victimhood narrative and also this martyr narrative, like, oh, you Gazans, you're going to save the Arabs, you're going to eradicate the Jewish state, you're going to clean the world of all the badness, blah, blah, blah. And so it's making them feel like totally empowering them and boosting their morale and making them feel like, yeah, we should do this. The whole world is looking at us now, is celebrating us. That was the Arab world even. Now it's across the Western world too. Like you're seeing protests in New York and in Paris. Like this is, of course, it's going to boost the morale and make them feel like, yeah, this is great. Everybody thinks we're amazing fighters. We're top of the world. And so it's going to encourage them through, and it's just a farce. They're being used as cannon fodder for this conflict that they are never going to win, that they will always lose. And the people that are using them as cannon fodder are always going to be safe. Like this Lebanese woman in her tank top and shorts, she gets to live in LA and wear whatever she wants and live her life comfortably, But this Gazan guy should be there fighting for her cause that she thinks is important, even though he doesn't believe in it at all. But she believes that he should be giving up his life for her cause. So you're right. I do see that side of it as well. I guess I can only hope that, that one side overtakes, that they start to just look at their circumstances and like, forget the propaganda, forget the TikTok videos and whatever we're being told or whatever we're being sold. This is our reality. Look how we're living. Look how the billions of dollars that came in here was not spent on us and for our empowerment and for our self-determination, but it was used instead to build tunnels and to build bombs and to cause havoc. And at the end of the day, we're the ones that are suffering and we're the ones that are living in misery out of our own doing. So I hope that they just recognize the reality that's in front of them more than the propaganda and the noise. But who knows? Because egos are big and Arab egos are significantly big. And I can definitely see, especially with young men too, like that could really pump them up and make them feel like, it's like the whole idea of jihad. If you kill yourself fi sabilillah, and if you kill non-Muslims fi sabilillah, then you're going to be like the highest levels of heaven. So these guys are willing to put on a suicide vest and go kill themselves because they think it's going to bring them some sort of rock star status. So not only do they have to wait till this rock star status, they don't have to wait till they go to heaven. They can get it right here, right now, from all over the world. So yeah, pretty sad. You really brought me back down to earth with that one. All right, so I'm going to open it up to questions with the group now. Make sure everybody gets an opportunity to share with you their thoughts. Not everybody, we got way too many people here, but some people anyway. So we will start with you, Mars. Go ahead.
Well, Yasmine, once again, thank you for doing this. I love these podcasts with the guests you have. Dr. Wilf, I went to Israel last year with a Sharaka group. I believe we had the pleasure of listening to you lecture in Tel Aviv. So it's a pleasure to hear you again. I've been reading your book, The War of Return, very slowly. It's incredibly informative, and I'm obsessed with Israel. I'm just trying to learn everything I can about it. I do have a question for you, though. I'm very supportive of Israel and the Jewish people at this time, especially when there's a lot of widespread anti-Semitism. But I'm a little disturbed to hear about a group that I believe is called the New Historians. I think that includes people like Shlomo Sand and Ilan Pop, who seem to talk about an almost completely contradictory narrative about Israel, about Israel's past. They seem to really have an obsessive focus on what happened at Deir Yassin, and it just seems to be against the accepted historical narrative from all the historians I've been listening to. Can you tell me more about who these people are and what their narrative and their angle is?
Certainly. First, a broader perspective. One of the most foundational facts of Jewish life is our existence as a minority. Even within the state of Israel, we're keenly aware of our minority status in an Arab and Muslim region, certainly globally. So as a people who've always been a minority and typically a persecuted minority, you always have, and that we have a long history of that going to the Middle Ages, of Jews who I would say felt that if they sold their people, they would be somehow spared. You know, in the Middle Ages, there were those medieval debates of Christianity versus Judaism. You know, if the Jews won the debates, they'd be slaughtered. If the Jews lost the debates, they would be slaughtered. But typically, the people who would defend Christianity were actually Jewish converts. So we actually have a long history of always having Jews who stand up and kind of think that if they sell their people, that somehow will gain them acceptance. And that's almost a perennial and sad fact of Jewish life. Specifically on the New Historians, they emerged in the 80s and 90s when a lot of archives became more available. And they basically began to tell a different story about Israel's founding, one that also basically showed that, let's say, during Israel's War of Independence, it's not that all the Arabs fled. Some of them were forcefully expelled, and that was something that did not exist in the narrative before. But what you had, and ultimately was just about doing more precise, more accurate history. What happened among the new historians is that some of them, like Schleim and Pepe, became, you know, that's where they would get tenure and advancements. And they basically began to tell a story of sheer Jewish and Zionist evil, which at one point became completely ahistorical. And there's one more Jewish historian, new Jewish historian, which I can't believe that his name escapes me now, but he also is quoted a lot in the War of Return. He's actually the best of them. I'm sure I'll remember at one point and I'll say his name, but he's the best of them, both as a historian and both as someone who says, okay, this is the history, but the history doesn't change the big picture, which at the end of the day, the Arabs were committed to, first of all, that the war itself was unnecessary in the sense that there was a proposal for partition for a Jewish state and an Arab state. We could have celebrated 75 years of Jewish and Arab state living in peace and prosperity side by side. So he said the Arab war was entirely unnecessary. It was waged for the sole purpose and declared purpose of preventing the Jewish state from coming into being, strangling it at birth, and it has failed in doing so. And it was a brutal 1.5-year war in which the Jewish side also committed some brutal acts, but it doesn't change the bigger picture that at the end of the day, the Jews fought a war for self-determination, and the Arabs fought a war to prevent Jewish self-determination, and nothing changes that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mars and Einat. Next, Cecile.
Thank you so much. I have to preface my question by saying that with the distance of time, when I look back to this truly distressing time, this moment of having you, Yasmine, and Dr. Wilf together will be one of my top 3 moments. This is an incredibly meaningful moment for me. Anyway, I think I'll be crying all day, but for the first time, I might actually cry because I feel happy and not in total distress. So thank you for doing this. I'm not sure how to ask my question here. Things in the West, I'm joining you from Canada, are so bad. And I don't need to tell you this. And I think that to some extent, so bad in terms of anti-Semitism. Just as a quick example, the Toronto District School Board, the biggest school board in Ontario, maybe one of the biggest in Canada, just adopted the new anti-racism strategy, which does not include anti-Semitism, but recognizes anti-Palestinian racism, which has not been defined, but has been taught in schools to mean that if you say that from the river to the sea is anti-Semitic, it's actually not them being anti-Semitic, it's us being engaging in anti-Palestinian racism. So I say this because we're seeing an institutionalization of anti-Semitism. And my question to you is, it's not clear to me how much of the left in Israel, or whatever is left of the left, understands that they may be contributing to this. And I say this because I've seen some people call out important Jewish voices in North America, including the president of the Anti-Defamation League, and essentially who will be tweeting something like Hamas is to blame for ABC, and somebody in Israel saying absolutely not, it's Netanyahu. And by the way, I completely support the legitimate criticism of Israel. It's part of democracy. There's a substantive difference between legitimate criticism and demonization and delegitimization, but it's not clear to me if they understand what is happening in the West.
So first of all, thank you. The historian whose name escaped me is Benny Morris. I highly recommend his books, and he also had a great 2-part podcast with Dan Senior on the War of 1948. So that's to put that. You're absolutely right. Whatever is left of the Israeli left doesn't get it for a very long time. I've been dealing and following the rise of anti-Zionism for a very long time, and I remember that I would sometimes be approached by senior figures in the Israeli political left who would say, Einat, but seriously, isn't it just a ruse by right-wing governments to deflect criticism of Israel? Now, and I would tell them, no, it's actually very serious and it's very dangerous. But a lot of Israelis live in this kind of bizarre Israeli bubble where it's all about us and it's all about Netanyahu, and I can almost empathize with that feeling, because I can tell you it comes from, my analysis is that it comes from a desire to escape the implications if you had to look reality in the eye. If you had to come to terms with the fact that Palestinians, that their ideology is really from water to water, Palestine will be Arab, that they never actually had a vision of peace where there's a Jewish state, Well, that's a difficult realization. It's much better to live in a world where the problem is Netanyahu, the settlements, and the occupation, because then you have a simple path. Get rid of Netanyahu, get rid of the settlements, get rid of the occupation, and we're good to go. But if you understand that it's something so deep, that's a tough realization. So I think a lot of people want to continue to live in a world where the problem is Netanyahu. And again, like you, I hope this government not only is removed from power soon, but never comes to close to any levers of power in the next century. But when people tell me Netanyahu this, that, I'm like, eyes on the ball. Eyes on the ball. The problem is that we are surrounded by enemies devoted to our non-existence. They do not have a criticism of a particular policy. Apropos the debate that Yasmine mentioned, apropos the debate, who was representing, the anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, it's Gideon Levy. And a lot of people who listen to him, a very left-wing Israeli columnist, a lot of people who listen to him were like, he doesn't get it. He lives in a world in his head that is disconnected from what's actually going on. So to your question, there are people who feed into it, but they don't think they feed into it because they live in some world where those are not real issues.
Thank you.
Sure.
Sorry, I muted myself and then I couldn't find my face. Next is Tochi.
Hey, Anat. Hey, Yasmine. Thanks for putting this on. This is fascinating. So, Anat, I was wondering, are you familiar with the Biafran War by any chance?
I remember growing up as a kid and it was at headlines, but I don't know enough.
Okay. I actually think that this is something that everyone should know about. I'm Igbo, so, we are possibly, cousins of sorts because we are supposedly Jewish. It's very possible. But the point is that the Biafran War has been very much buried. And I think it's something that people should know about because it is we went through the exact same thing that y'all are going through now. A lot of people might not realize at the time it was painted as the Igbos wanted to secede from the rest of Nigeria. It was looked at as we were these revolutionary separatists, and that's why we just wanted our own place. But the truth of the matter is that, and I'm just finding this out, is that in fact we were pogromed. We had October 7th happened like over and over and over again, which is what led us to actually try to secede. We were getting massacred left, right, and center by jihadis, of course. And that's essentially what happened. And then when we wanted to self-determine, what essentially happened was England, surprisingly, but not surprisingly, sided with the jihadis. And we were shocked because we were like, we're Christian in the South, Igbos, most of us are Christian. And why would you side with the Arab Muslims? But the truth of the matter is that the British have always done this. And when you start to look deep into it, and I recommend anybody who's interested in this to look at Colonel Ojukwu, who is our leader. He writes a very interesting speech about this in '69. And he mentions the culprits of this war are Arab Muslim expansionism, because at the time, the Sokoto Caliphate and people who were the north of Nigeria were trying to Islamize the rest of the country, and they still are. So they were the main culprits. The British, obviously, trying to maintain control through the Arab Muslims, because the Arab Muslims at the time, the war started a month after the Six-Day War. So this is a time of Pan-Arabism, and they were trying to agitate all the Muslim countries in Africa, and in particular the Muslim minorities. They were trying to agitate their groups into essentially Islamizing the rest of those African states. And you'll read in his declaration, he literally calls out the exact people that we're dealing with now: the Arab Muslim expansionism, British Western interest, and the newly encroaching Bolsheviks, aka the Russians. And he's like, I know how far, and he's like, I'm scared to know how far an imam and a Bolshevik together will go in terms of spreading propaganda. the point is, this is not new. None of this stuff is new. It's the same old actors, unfortunately. And the problem is jihadis will come through, start a conflict, their Western and Eastern friends will rewrite history, and then it gets buried, right? So I do think that I have spoken for a bit, but the thing that I'm actually a little bit surprised about is having, like, I lived in Saudi Arabia, so I'm well aware of the fact that a fair amount of Arab countries don't want y'all to exist. I mean, that was very obvious to me. And I do think, to Yasmine's point, that Arab Muslims have made it very clear what they want. And I'm surprised that in a way that I don't know if Israelis are just figuring it out or were they in denial? Because to me, it's like, this is really obvious. I mean, you've been dealing with the Hebron massacre. You've been dealing with all this stuff from time. Why all the attempts at peace and all that kind of stuff? I mean, if someone wants you eradicated, that's a completely different conversation to someone that wants to work with you. And I do wonder, is there like a lack of historical knowledge in, on the, like, are Israeli schools just not teaching their kids what they need to know to survive? Anyway, that was kind of my overall thought.
So first of all, thank you, and I will read more now, certainly through that lens. It's very interesting, and he definitely had the correct instinct that the kind of combination that really began in the 60s, this cooperation between, even in the 50s, between the Soviet Union and the Muslim world, using automatic majorities in the UN to rewrite history, it has indeed been very powerful. When you're asking about how Israelis, in a sense, don't get it, so some do, but also this goes to the previous question. It's a very tough realization to live with. So we construct other stories whereby if we only did this, if we only tried harder here, because otherwise it's a very difficult realization. There's a phrase in Hebrew that talks about, shall you live on your sword forever? And people are like, so what are you saying? We shall have to live on our sword forever? People want to believe that there's a way out. And we also tend to project. So we have projected on the Arabs, on the Palestinians, our desires. So we wanted a state, even if it was smaller. So we believe that they want a state, and they don't really, really mean it. In the book, I invented a word. I called it West-plaining. It's when Western diplomats and journalists explain away what Palestinians have clearly said and inconveniently said. And within Israel, we have West-plaining too, where we're basically saying, well, they might say from the river to the sea, but no, they really, this is just an opening position for negotiations. Right. Because we desperately want to believe that, and it's hard for us to accept and to live in a world where the other side wants nothing less than our non-existence. It's tough.
Yeah, and very quickly, if I can just add, I think your point about the European and the West, in particular, coming in and with all the data, you would think, you're like, oh, they live in values of freedom. Why wouldn't they want to support Israel? And to be honest with you, because I think it's very clear what the Arab Muslim world wants, but it's not very clear what the European world wants. And that's always, well, to be honest with you, as a Nigerian, that's my issue with Europeans in general. They can be very, very slimy with that. But my point is, I would love to hear, I would love to see more exploration on that. And I do think some of the work that you're doing, I've seen others in Israel really trying to call to task what the European powers are doing, because I think there's a long history of Europeans in general quelling people who are trying to self-determine.
Yep, it's a good point. That questioning is really something that I'm doing more and more, because yes, at one point you have to wonder, because they're not even following their own policies. So you begin to wonder about their motivations.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Einat. Next is Amalia.
Hello. And you're going to have to forgive me ahead of time. I'm very emotional. Being able to, I live in Israel. I live in Bat Yam, and I'm American. And I'm so embarrassed. I'm so sorry. I didn't think I'd be this emotional. But Dr. Wilf, you were one of my first breaths of fresh air. My husband his family's from Yemen and Iraq, born and raised in Bat Yam. So he takes a lot of this much more in stride, like, yeah, welcome to Israel. For me, I've lived here 14 years, but I'm an American. And a friend of mine was killed on October 7th, as was so many people. Left, when you were describing, Dr. Wilf, like leftist ideas, I was there 100%. Like, Gazans need to be able to live freely, and if we could just help them, and why do we have settlements, and if it wasn't for Bibi, we could have peace. And I believed that all the way. And October 7th just shook me to my core, and October 8th even more so. And I think I cried daily for at least 4 months. And you were one of the first I heard on Call Me Back with Dan Senor. And it was the first time I started to hear these voices. Sam Harris, which led me to you, Yasmine, and to feel like I wasn't completely crazy or alone. So it just means a lot for me to be here. And I guess I have 2 questions. Has anything surprised you? I mean, I think both of you probably saw all of this coming. I was caught very off guard by the anti-Semitism, by everything. But has anything since October 7th really surprised you that you didn't see coming? And if so, what was the biggest thing? I guess that's my first question. And my second question would be, most of the people that I was friends with, even friends since I was a child, no longer speak to me because I'm Israeli, and since October 7th, which has also been really hard. And I find that I've just been labeled by people who've known me my whole life, who know that I'm left, I marched in a Black Lives Matter thing. I mean, I'm there for everybody, like trans, gay, everybody. I'm there for you. Like, I got you. Like, we all deserve to live and be happy. Palestinians. I've had Palestinians here for Shabbat dinner. Like, we sent my daughter to an Arab school in Yaffo. Like, I'm all there for everybody. And to be suddenly labeled as either I'm been completely like hoodwinked because I live in Israel, so I just like have wool over my eyes, or I'm an Israeli baby killer. Either way, I'm a liar. Either I don't know what I'm talking about, or I'm a liar. So nothing, I mean, I just stopped talking to anybody because nothing I can say you're going to believe. So I guess that's my second question, is like, and it feels silly to even ask it feels childish, but do you have any advice for that? Like, how do you have this strength to keep talking to people? Like, just both of you, your strength in facing that, it blows my mind. So thank you both. You're helping me. Both of you are helping me. So thank you.
Thank you. It's deeply meaningful. So first, your first question about being surprised. Obviously, I was surprised by the attack itself. It was such an insane scenario that like many Israelis, the sense of fragility of the world remains with us. If that happened, then I don't know anything anymore in that sense. But I wasn't surprised by the fact itself, by the ideology, by the fact that they planned and perpetrated it. And I was certainly not surprised by what you called October 8th, by the global response, by the immediate kind of presumption that Israel's to blame, that actually this is by all means necessary, because this is something that I've really followed and seen built very carefully, this vilifying of Israel, Zionism, the Star of David, to the point that anything that is done to the collective Jew is retroactively justified. But the sense of betrayal, I know, is deep. One of the things that I've been telling, I speak to many Jewish groups around the world now, and I tell them this is a moment of great peril. Yasmine, you talked about how Douglas spoke about the Jewish people will survive and thrive. Well, as a people, collectively, yes. But will all Jews survive and thrive is right now of more immediate concern, because when you look at Jewish history, ultimately we figure out, we come back, but there is a lot of suffering in the process, and especially in the last few months, I've reflected on the supporters of Palestinianism, right? I spoke about the Nazis, and then the Pan-Arabists, and then the Soviets, and then the Iranians. So on the one hand, the good news is I have no doubt that the Mullah and Ayatollah regime will find itself in the same dustbin of history as its predecessor supporters of Palestinianism. The bad news is that on the way to the dustbin of history, all these forces, the Nazis, the Pan-Arabists, the Soviets, caused a lot of damage to the Jews and some global mayhem. And my question is, where are we right now on that chart? Is most of the damage to the Jews and the suffering behind us? Is it ahead of us? Is the global mayhem behind us or ahead of us? So a lot of my concern right now is, yes, in the long term, the Jewish people will survive and thrive. But right now, I'm focused on how we minimize damage to our people wherever we are, in Israel and around the world. And I am filled with dread, and I do feel, and that's to your second question, the only thing I can do is talk. To talk, to write, to speak. These are issues that I'm not like coming out of nowhere. These are literally the issues I've studied and worked and written about for years now. And obviously, not happily, but more people are willing to listen, because when I said those things before October 7th, like I said, it's a harsh, unpleasant message. People want to believe in something easier, sunnier. Now more people are willing to listen because it's a message that more fits with reality. But it's the only thing I can do. But I can tell you, I have great moments of dread and fear. Just yesterday, I suddenly had a moment when I thought, this is all a bad dream, right? It can't be that all of this is happening. It's a bad dream. And I remember just being shocked to my core by the possibility that all of this is real. This is where I find strength, and I find strength also in the friends who get it. So what I've learned from a lot of people in the last few months, yes, people have lost friends, family, but people have also gained friends. People who have suddenly emerged to say, actually, we get it. We really get it now.
Thank you, Einat. Sending you hugs, Amalia. There are a lot of people that still have more questions for you, Einat, but I've taken up too much of your time. And so I'm going to ask everybody who still has questions for Einat to please connect with her directly. I will share her information in the description below. And then you can reach out to her and ask her your question or share your comment with her. But we're going to be here all night if I don't wrap this up. I know how difficult it is. I also have a million more things I want to talk to her about, but we have to respect your time. So Einat, I want to make sure that I give you the final word. Are there any, any advice, general advice, thoughts, comments things that you want us to know or understand, anything that we didn't talk about that you think is important to note, let us know.
So first, I really want to thank you, you specifically, Yasmine, and the people who came. I really, it's deeply meaningful, and I appreciate you being so open. I think what I do want to say, that even though it's a tiny glimmer, I want to talk about what is a source of hope for me these days, and it has a lot to do with you, Yasmine, and people like you. One of the glimmers of hope that has sustained me in the last few months is that I think more than ever before, we have Arab, Muslim, ex-Muslim voices that are speaking up for Israel, for the Jewish people, against anti-Zionism, against anti-Semitism. In my experience, they are some of the most effective voices, precisely because of what was said here earlier, because in what you said, Yasmine, you never had any question about what the conflict is. You knew what it was about, so you can actually talk to it from your own background and experience and call it out, call out. You're not falling for the globalized intifada from the river to the sea. You know exactly what it means. And sometimes people look at my journey and what I've written, and they say, "Oh, so you no longer believe in peace. You're no longer from the Israeli left." And I say, I very much am. I call myself a long-term peace activist. And I say that I do believe in the possibility, it's happened throughout human history, of transformation, of change, of the reinterpretation of civilizations, of religions, of systems of thought. And I've come to call it Arab Zionism or Muslim Zionism. The fact that I believe that one day, we already begin to see that, but we will have more and more Arab and Muslim voices who will look at a Jewish state not as a shameful stain that must be excised by any means necessary, but rather as a mark of honor. And that the existence of a sovereign Jewish people will be considered by more Arabs and Muslims and ex-Muslims as actually compatible, something that belongs in this region rather than something that needs to be pushed out. So I'm not saying that it happens tomorrow morning, but it is the vision that I uphold, and I say, this is what true peace looks like. Nothing, we can have arrangements, wars, ceasefires, but real peace will be an Arab and Islamic acceptance that when the Jewish people are in the land of Israel, they're not foreigners, they're not white European colonialists, they're actually Abraham. They are a historic people with a historic connection to the land, where their sovereign state only represents that historic connection. So as much as it is a tiny glimmer of hope, you, Yasmine, are part of that glimmer, and that's what I hold as my vision for peace and what I work towards for.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I share that vision of peace with you, and I'm very honored to be one of those glimmers. And hopefully these glimmers of light continue until it is, the dominant, overpowering light, and it will, just overpower the darkness. So thank you so much, Einat. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us here today. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye, everyone.
After hearing all that, you might be left wondering, what can I do? How can I help? Well, this is why I created a nonprofit called Free Hearts, Free Minds. We are the only organization dedicated exclusively to helping these free thinkers. We empower them with our programs and supportive community, lifting them up so they can heal, speak out, and begin to make positive changes, not just in their own lives, but within the broader community around them. If this is a cause that resonates with you and you want to make a difference, one way to do that is by donating to Free Hearts, Free Minds. Because not enough people care about this cause, we need people like you to help fuel this change. You can donate via our website, freeheartsfreeminds.com. Thank you. Every dollar you donate makes a difference.